Hang on to it. Something else to say about Chrystia Freeland is I think you became Minister for Foreign Affairs a few days before the inauguration of Donald Trump. There aren't many of your predecessors, I'm guessing, who've had quite as large and groaning intrays as you've had in your time, and including a certain kind of event into which Canada seems to be placed, not, as it were, through its own choosing. And I guess we'd better begin with today. The news of a former Canadian diplomat, Michael Kovrig, being arrested in China in what many people are saying may be retaliation for the arrest in this country on behalf of the US law enforcement authorities of the Chinese company Huawei's CFO. She was in court again, I think, again today. Could you just tell us what your government's understanding is of the current situation and what you're going to do about it?
You're really starting soft, Mark. I like that.
I did the bit about the bicycle too.
Yeah, okay, thank you. No, so look, all laughing aside, when it comes to consular cases, and speaking as Canadian foreign ministers, particularly of Canadians detained abroad, what we have first and foremost in mind is that these are people. These are our compatriots, and we have a tremendously important duty of care that we take really seriously. We've been in touch with Mr. Kovrig's family, and we have raised the issue with the Chinese authorities. When it comes to the case of, as we do always, and I want to say, especially if his family members are hearing us tonight, this has our attention at the very highest levels of our government. We're very, very focused on it, and know that we are concerned. When it comes to the case of Ms. Meng, I think it's really important to be clear that Canada is a rule of law country, and Canada is a country that believes in abiding by its treaty obligations. In the case of Ms. Meng, all due process, all Canadian due process has been followed to this point. This is a situation where there has been no political interference at all. This has been purely a case of abiding by treaty obligations. At this point, as you mentioned, Mark, her case is before the courts. We have been very clear with China that she has been convicted of breaking no laws. She absolutely ought to have Chinese officials have full consular access to her. We need to treat her in a respectful way, and that is what we are seeking to do. And at this stage, the case is before the courts and is being handled by Canadian judges in accordance with the law, and that's how it has to be. And I am sure everyone appreciates here, and I certainly appreciate also the geopolitical complexity potentially radiating from all of this. But being a rule of law country is core to who we are as a country. And being a rule of law country, you can't, it's not like going to a buffet. You can't sort of say, I follow rule of law for these two dishes because I really like them, but this one I don't like so much, so we're not going to be rule of law in this matter. At this point, the case is before Canadian judges. I've spot in the audience Tom Heinzman, one of Canada's most distinguished lawyers, and I think Tom, he really is, and I think Tom will agree with me that our independent legal system is one of the finest, if not the finest, in the world. I trust it. Canadians should trust it, and our partners around the world should trust it too.
Ms. Freeland, you said you're concerned, obviously, about Michael Kovrig, and you're in touch with the Chinese government about his case. But you didn't say whether or not you think it's related. Are these two things related?
That's right, that I didn't say that.
Yes. We noticed. Have you had any indications from the Chinese government that they're related?
We are treating Mr. Kovrig's case really seriously. He is a Canadian who has been detained, and we're very focused on it. We've raised it with the Chinese authorities, and we're in touch with his family.
Okay. What other pressure has the Chinese government tried to put on Canada since Ms. Meng's arrest? They called your ambassador in. There's a lot of trade between Canada and China. It's a big, important thing to Canada. What are the potential ramifications of this?
You know, I think, Peter, that's really a question for China. What is important for us to communicate to China and also to Canadians is what I've just said, that this case, the detention of Ms. Meng, is not a political judgment by Canada. This is about Canada abiding by an extradition treaty with no political interference at all.
Are you told about this arrest before it happens, or does it happen automatically without your knowledge?
The Prime Minister has said that he was informed that it would happen. And in accordance with our processes, there was no interference. We believe very strongly in following our treaty commitments and in not interfering politically. There's a real slippery slope there that you can slide down incredibly quickly. And, you know, both Mark and Merrick referred at the beginning to this being a pretty complicated time in the world. We're seeing a lot of countries around the world that are starting to play fast and loose with democratic institutions and with rule of law. Canada is not going to be one of those countries, and it's not always so easy to be a rule of law country, but in the fullness of time, we're always going to be glad that we stick to that. And I just want to say, well, yeah, we agree with that, right? And I'm going to say just one more thing to Peter's question. It's important for us, and we're working on this, to be sure that this reality of what has happened is fully explained by us to China. And I do want to take this opportunity to say that Canada's relationship with China is important. It's a relationship that we value. It's a relationship that can and will and must continue.
You said there are countries around the world that are showing some signs of playing fast and loose with rule of law systems, and they may or may not be as committed to rule of law as they had once been. Do you include the United States in that list?
You know what? Actually, I think that one of the things that a lot of people have commented on, including many New York Times reporters and commentators, is the incredible resilience of U.S. institutions, very much including the rule of law and the judiciary. And I think Canadians, you know, we're right next door to you guys. We have the world's longest unmilitarized border. Quite a few of us read the New York Times, in fact. And so, you know, Canadians are well aware of the working of the U.S. judiciary and, you know, frankly, some of the really admirable ways that the U.S. judiciary has operated. Now, I think the Canadian judiciary is the very best, of course, but...
Just before, I'm sure we're going to spend much of this conversation talking about US-Canada relations. Just before then, this broader point about countries which are playing fast and loose. There was an instance in the summer where you did something which a few years ago would have been regarded as being unremarkable. You, I think, tweeted or certainly let it be known that you and the Canadian government.
It was a tweet. I know what you're talking about.
Were anxious about the treatment of some women's rights advocates in Saudi Arabia, and the response of the Saudi Arabian government was very aggressive to that tweet. And I suppose my question really is, do you have to think carefully? I mean, if, as you say, Canada, in a sense, is playing by old rules, or traditional rules, tried and tested rules, you might well argue, but there are other countries there which, for whatever reason, have decided to throw away that rule book in ways which potentially could be damaging to Canada. Do you and your colleagues have to think carefully about language and about tactics, given how different the climate is out there now?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, Mark. And of course, we have to think really carefully about language and tactics, always. And I hope that Canadian ministers, that ministers of the Crown, always have done that. But you're right that we're living in a fraught time, and in a time when some certainties are not so certain anymore. You know, my favorite book at the moment is, and I think I'm going to give you a New York Times another plug. I think I saw this reviewed in the New York Times book review a couple of weeks ago, is the new Robert Kagan book, The Jungle Grows Back. And, you know, the basic argument he makes is that the post-war rules-based international order and domestic liberal democracies are not the resting natural state of the world, and that they are not also kind of the natural, you know, state to which we are all inevitably, as humans and as human societies and as a world community, progressing. But what he argues instead is that this was quite a deliberate, quite a conscious effort to construct something in the post-war period, led by the United States. If I had been Bob's editor, I would have said, you should point out more the role Canada played in building this order, because we were there at the creation. But his core point is, with the Jungle Grows Back point, is you know, that this post-war order, it's like a garden. You know, my dad's a farmer, so I would say it's like a farm. And if you don't weed it all the time, if you don't seed your crops every spring, if you don't fertilize them, if you don't weed them as a gardener or spray them as a farmer, and if you don't harvest them, you're not going to have a garden anymore. So to your point, I wouldn't say it's old-fashioned rules that we believe in. It's actually the liberal democracy that we're lucky enough to have now. And I think as Canadians, we are very conscious that we are very lucky. I would argue, and I don't think that this is gloating at all, I think Canada is the strongest liberal democracy in the world right now. And if you guys disagree with me, name me one that's stronger. Right? Truly. Like, we're standing pretty strong, and that's great. It means we have to pay a lot of attention to weeding our garden at home, because we are not under any illusions, you know, as a government, and I'm going to speak for Canadians here. I think we know we're not immune to the disruptive forces other liberal democracies are facing. And you're right, Mark. Like, being the strongest liberal democracy in the world, it can put you in some awkward circumstances in the rest of the world. But I think we need to be proud of who we are and stand up for who we are, and frankly, help people who are living in darker places right now. You guys are clapping too much. It's going to make the reporters mad and ask meaner questions.
No. You say that Canada is the strongest liberal democracy in the world right now, and this is a fascinating week, actually, to have that conversation, because if you look at Europe, of course, we've got Theresa May struggling with Brexit, possibly on the edge of...
I think we have to question Mark about that.
We should question Mark about that, but we've got President Macron, obviously, in retreat with the yellow vests, and Angela Merkel now has anointed a like-minded successor, but she's on her way out.
She had to win a contest.
She had to win a contest.
In the CDU.
Yes.
AKK. She wasn't anointed. She was She was Merkel's choice.
Yes, yes.
I was in Berlin on Friday and Saturday, and like that was a real race.
It was. My only point is that she's now on her way out, and that Merkel, who had been seen as a leader, if not the leader of the Western world in some level, is going to be retreating from the stage at some point soon. What do you see, these larger forces that are happening? John Lewis Gaddis told me recently, he says it's not a surprise that the liberal international order of the Cold War is beginning to fray. What's surprising is it lasted this long after the end of the Cold War. So what replaces it? And what are we supposed to be doing right now? What are we, as a larger democratic rule of order world, supposed to be doing to replace what had existed in this superpower conflict that no longer is quite the same?
So I wouldn't use the verb replace. I would say more renew and make fit for purpose for the 21st century. And there is certainly work there to be done. And, I put the challenges in sort of two categories. I think one challenge is the one that people who thought about this kind of thing have been thinking about for 20 or 30 years. Certainly, when I was at the FT, many columns and editorials were written about this, which is how is our rules-based international order, which at the end of the day was based on the transatlantic alliance, Canada, US, Western Europe, maybe plus Japan. How are we going to expand that to accommodate the rising powers, particularly of Asia? And that was a question a lot of people have been thinking about for a long time, and that question still needs to be figured out. I think the new question, which has kind of hoved into view that was less expected, was what happens if established liberal democracies start being a little bit less convinced of the value of being an established liberal democracy. And look, Peter, I'm not going to pretend that in a soundbite I can answer what we do. What I would say is, and Canada, what I'm about to say is something Canada is doing, we need to work hard to work with like-minded countries to get things done. Instead of cursing the darkness, let's light a single candle. And I'm going to give a specific example, small but valuable, of a thing that we've done. So Syria, huge, terrible tragedy. I think there is still going to be a moral accounting of us, the West, and the fact that we allowed this to happen. And it's not over. There was a moment this summer, late June, when the Assad forces were taking more and more territory. And there's a group in Syria called the White Helmets, who are really, really brave volunteers who got together to rescue fellow Syrians who'd been attacked and to gather evidence of war crimes. And as Assad was making progress, they were getting squeezed, and the White Helmets were particularly targeted by Assad and Putin, that there was not going to be reconciliation with them, that they were being called terrorists, and they were in real danger. All of this happened just before the NATO meeting. And you'll remember the summer NATO meeting was a rather interesting, dramatic time. But as it was happening, we, Canada, became aware of what was happening. We raised it. We said we have a moral responsibility to rescue these people. Western countries, including Canada, had actually been funding the White Helmets. And that resonated particularly with Germany, with Heiko Maas, and with the UK, Jeremy Hunt. And we worked together, crucially with the support of the US, without the US being involved and helping us. Also, Israel and Jordan were crucial. But it was us, like-minded countries, stepping up, taking the lead, and some of those White Helmets are already in Canada. I met them a few weeks ago, a group of them, and they're such great people. They were saying they are really glad to be here, and they want to set up their own White Helmets in Canada, but they don't know what problem they could address. So this is actually true. So they're thinking of maybe forest fires. But, my point here is that we, countries who believe in the liberal rules-based international order, we need to step up We need to take the lead. We need to form alliances of a kind that maybe we weren't forming before. And I don't want to overstate this specific example. It's not the solution to everything, but it shows that we need to just start doing it.
In your view, does Donald Trump believe in that kind of rules-based, multilateral, multinational body? Because it's, I mean, get me out of here, were his words at the end of the G20. And isn't it a problem if the leader of what has historically been the principal guarantor of this order seems to have pretty serious problems with it himself?
But you know what? So that's why I used the white helmets example, because the U.S. was not the leader, but President Trump personally helped to make it happen. And President Trump's personal engagement was one of the reasons it was possible to take the white helmets through Israel to Jordan and onto their other final destinations. And actually, Jeremy Hunt and Theresa May were very essential to that, as was Heiko Maas of Germany. So, you know, stuff can still be done, and it's important, you know, for us as political leaders to try to work not only to kind of despair, there's a lot to despair about, Mark, don't get me wrong, but to also think about, okay, where are the places where we can actually do something good?
And just to understand it, so you're saying that Donald Trump's remarks about the United Nations, about NATO, his
about Canada,
about extensively about Canada, that at some level doesn't matter or can be worked around?
No, I didn't say that, Mark, and you know that I didn't say that. And, you know, look, it's not...
You've given us one admirable example against the backdrop of a year where a lot of organisations of exactly the kind you're talking about, on which this order was built, have been on the receiving end of really aggressive language from the American president.
I was Canada's lead NAFTA negotiator, so I am familiar with the challenges. But I do, and I agree, I take your point that it is important not to pretend they're not there. You know, the first step towards, you know, accomplishing something is to scope out what is the depth of the challenge. And I take your point that there is a really big challenge. All that I'm arguing is, okay, it's one thing to, you know, be worried and be sad in our kitchens, but then let's also, you know, roll up our sleeves and see what we can do.
I want to point out it was 20 minutes in before Donald Trump's name was mentioned, which for me is a record in my last couple of years. But that brings me back to Buenos Aires, where the G20 met. I mean, that's where you and I were last together, just about a week ago. She was on stage. I was in the scrum in the back with the photographers and the badly dressed people. But what was striking about this was the ceremony where Prime Minister Trudeau, President Trump, and President Peña Nieto signed the new North American Free Trade Agreement, or U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, whatever you want to call it.
Or Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement, as we call it in Canada.
Yeah.
And it was a striking ceremony. First, there are a couple of things I want to ask about this. One is it true that the Prime Minister was at least contemplating not coming, because it wasn't originally on his schedule?
Our objective was always to get to a signing on the 30th of November. And we're glad that we got there.
Okay. I have new appreciation for my Canadian colleagues. What was it that made him want to go in the end? What was the deciding factor for him to actually attend the ceremony? Not to sign it, because it was going to be signed, but to attend the ceremony.
You know, that the deal was done. And this is an important agreement for Canada and the United States. And the new NAFTA is a good agreement for Canada and the United States. I will say, Peter, that as the Prime Minister said in his remarks, and you were there, you heard him, what was and continues to be really a source of great concern for Canada is the continued imposition of 232 national security tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. And we're really not happy about that. We consider these tariffs to be illegal and unjust. We are challenging them at the NAFTA tribunal, and we kept Chapter 19, and that is a very good place to challenge stuff. And we're challenging them at the WTO. We have also imposed retaliatory dollar-for-dollar tariffs in response. And, you know, the reason, and I will offer just one other fact about it, which is it's worth pointing out to people that our trade in steel with the United States, between Canada and the U.S., is perfectly balanced. The U.S. has a slight surplus. But the reason that this is such an issue for Canada is the national security justification. I mean, come on. You know, we are partners in NATO. We are partners in NORAD. We share the world's largest undefended border. As people are now aware, we have an extradition treaty. And to say that somehow Canadian steel and aluminum poses a national security threat really is beyond the pale. And so, given that we've now actually concluded our trade agreement, which never should have been part of the conversation because it's national security, but we've done our trade deal. We are great security partners. It really is not on to have these 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. So that is a concern that Canada continues to have in our relationship, in our economic relationship with the U.S.
Well, and he did mention that,
and
as you
the Prime
said.
Minister was clear about that.
He was very clear about that. One of the things I was struck by watching him, though, and I was only a few feet away, was he stared forward most of the time. He didn't really look to his side very much. I would say it was a little like a hostage video I've seen in the past. And the warmth that he had at least expressed in the past for his friend Donald, I would say was no longer there. It struck me a year ago when we were here that the strategy for Canada in dealing with a volatile figure like Donald Trump was the Prime Minister would be the good cop, you would be the tough cop. And what you got...
I am very physically threatened.
What you got in return... He said that, hasn't he? President Trump has said that about you, if I remember correctly. But what you got in return was weak and dishonest, we're not going to sign the communique, you know, and so forth and so on. What is the strategy today? If the charm offensive was of limited utility, what is today's strategy toward dealing with President Trump?
Well, I would challenge the notion that our strategy towards the U.S. has been of limited utility because we have a good trade agreement. And that has been the dominant issue in our relationship with the United States. And, you know, at the very beginning of the NAFTA negotiation, we said there were going to be a lot of moments of drama. We were not mistaken in that prediction, but we got there in the end. And I think for our government, and you know, I hope I can say most Canadians would agree, we got to a good place. So that was the objective. We got there.
Did you ever think of not signing until the steel and aluminum tariffs issue was resolved? I mean, given how strongly you feel about it, it will not stand, we can't accept it. It's slightly curious to be part of a photo op on the broader trade treaty, isn't it?
So it's a good question, Mark. Our position on the 232 tariffs in the NAFTA negotiations, because you will recall, and like Canadians really will recall this, the NAFTA negotiations, I feel like were like a national, I don't know, like a Netflix series or something. Like, people were very focused on it.
And I guess people here will know that the 232 is the clause which is that's a national security justification for...
Yeah. No, like Canadians have become very wonkish on trade issues. People like stop me in the grocery store. They're like, so, you know, rules of origin, do you think the labor value requirement, how does that work? Truly, this is not, I'm not joking, it's actually true. So our position, which is the legally right position, back to rule of law, from the outset, the 232 tariffs were imposed while the NAFTA negotiations were ongoing. And we were very clear that a national security consideration is not and cannot be part of a trade negotiation. And that's actually the case in the US legislation which creates the national security consideration. It is not about anything other than whether or not there is a national security threat. And that's the case we're making at NAFTA and WTO tribunals. So, and we have been saying this, Mark, since before the 232 tariffs were imposed, and we've said it throughout. So it's been very important for us to be true to our own arguments about this and to keep these two in different lanes. Having said that, we also, and the Prime Minister was absolutely right to make the point as he did on November 30th, it was absolutely important to not hide our displeasure. And I'll just say one more thing about November 30th, what happened there, because this is a key point. In addition to signing the new NAFTA, we signed some side letters between Canada and the US. Those letters entered into legal force on the moment of signing. So they entered into legal force on November 30th. Crucially for us, one of those side letters was about 232 on cars and car parts. And it's in force, it exists, and it provides Canada with what I think of as a flood insurance policy, which effectively protects our car sector from 232 tariffs were they to be levied on other countries by the US on cars and car parts. That's a pretty great thing to have.
Let me ask, I think we're wrapping up. One more before we have questions from the audience. Let me ask on that, though. President Trump, on the way home, I was on Air Force One with him on the way home from Buenos Aires. He says, I'm going to terminate NAFTA. Now that we've got this deal signed, I'm going to go ahead and terminate NAFTA as soon as I get back. I think he then realized that it was President Bush's big accomplishment, and maybe doing it the week of President Bush's funeral wasn't the nicest thing in the world. But he's going to do it, he says, anyway, in the coming days. They would start a 6-month clock, if I understand, in terms of withdrawal. In effect, he's daring Congress, you have to pass this new one by 6 months, otherwise we have nothing, or we go back to we actually have to go back to a Canada-U.S. free trade agreement separate from the Mexico,
right.
Is that right?
It's never been abrogated,
right.
And it kind of lies underneath
right.
NAFTA.
So if NAFTA, in theory, went away, there would still be this underlying thing that would govern our trade relationship. But what do you make of Congress and your Parliament? What will this does not go into effect until both those and the Mexican legislature passes it. Will you have any trouble here in Canada? And what if Congress comes back and says, well, we've got all these different things we want to do with the enacting legislation? Does that unravel things if they begin mucking around in it?
Okay, so many questions there. And, the core answer is our work with the United States and Mexico was the work of negotiating this new NAFTA. And the U.S., in your system, you clearly designate who is the person we're supposed to negotiate with. It is the USTR, in this case, Ambassador Lighthizer. He was our counterparty from the US, and we worked at it really hard and spent a lot of time at it, but at the end of the day, we got an agreement with the US and Mexico. At this point, as you pointed out, Peter, what's left is the domestic processes in each country, in Canada, in the US, and in Mexico. I think as Canadians, we would not take very warmly to another country getting involved in our own domestic ratification process. And we take the same respectful attitude towards the U.S. domestic ratification process. That's something for Ambassador Lighthizer and the administration to handle. And I will say, Ambassador Lighthizer, he is certainly a tough negotiator for the U.S. I hope he would say I'm a tough negotiator for Canada. But he's also a real pro.
Okay, I think we're about to go to a question from the audience. If I can have one last one as well, which is a change of subject. A change of subject, which is it's really partly because of your own background in our world as a journalist. And I know this is not your brief, but your government's recently announced a package of tax credits, about $600 million worth of tax credits, which are intended, the detail yet to come, to support the journalism in Canada. I guess my question is, Give us a sense of how about how you feel the current state of journalism in this country, its economics, and whether 600 million of tax credits over 5 years is really the kind of scale of intervention which is likely to support it and strengthen it.
So, yeah, that is a great question. And I have known you since before I became a politician. And I think, you know, even in that time, we've had conversations about how hard it is to fund good journalism today. You know, it is a truism that I think all people know, but certainly, you know, you guys as current journalists, me as a former one, are very aware of. It's hard to find the business model that supports journalism. At the same time, and I'm going to come back to where we started, liberal democracy is under threat. And we really believe, our government, in the importance of journalism as a key pillar of liberal democracy. Without good journalism, you cannot have good democracy. I was really pleased that Time magazine named journalists as their heroes of the year. And one of my favorite books is Tim Snyder's new book, The Path to Unfreedom, and he dedicates it to journalists who he calls the heroes of our time. So that's why we did it, is because we know, you know, you're faced with these two things. One, the business model is really challenged, but two, your society needs it to be healthy. So I feel very comfortable that we've done the right thing. Details still need to be worked out. And, you know, the other thing I'll say, which you will understand very much given your own history, Mark, is, you know, Mark used to run the BBC. We love the CBC, right? Canada also has a tradition of a public broadcaster that I believe plays a crucial role in, you know, informing our democracy and also actually in keeping our country together.
Great.
So yeah, Mark, we've got four mics in the audience. Raise your hand. We'll try our best to get to everybody. Tell the minister your name and make your question really short. No speeches, please. Who's first?
And if you live in University Rosedale, you can say that too. Oh, yeah. I have to be extra nice to you.
First question in the West End over there.
Oh, hi. Elizabeth Hurley, and thank you very much for the work you do. I just wanted to ask you about, with an election coming up in Canada, what's the government going to do about misinformation and other governments that might interfere in our country?
Do you want me to answer one by one or let everybody ask?
No, let's go one by one.
One by one? Okay. So, Elizabeth, I think that is a great question. Corinna Gould, our Minister for Democratic Institutions, has been talking about that, as has Ralph Goodale. I think we should not take the threat of malign foreign interference lightly at all. And, you know, we as a government are definitely working on that. But the other thing that I would say is, I think above all, what matters is informed people. We've met as part of our work on this. We've spent a lot of time talking to the Baltic republics. Canada leads the NATO battle group in Latvia, so we talk a lot with the Latvians, but also with the Estonians and the Lithuanians. And we had a meeting a couple of months ago with a group of Estonians, including like the guy in Estonia whose job is to fend off malign interference, which in that case means Russia, and like that's a big job. And I asked him that question, and Corinna was there too, and he said, you know what? The strength that we have is Estonians are really aware that this effort is there and that it's constant. And that aware citizenry is actually our biggest secret. It's not about fancy cyber stuff, it's about people being smart and alert. And at the end of the day, I think that's going to be a key part for us.
Person near the back, stand up, please.
Hello, Minister. Jeffrey Weeb. Those nefarious words, middle power. If it was ever fact, it had some sort of currency at one point. Is it still relevant now?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I am careful to qualify when I talk about Canada as a middle power, because I think since we live right next door to the Americans, we sort of think of ourselves as a middle power. But we're the 10th largest economy in the world, and to give you a sense of what that means, our economy is a little bigger than Russia's, right? So think about that for a minute. We're not that small. People think we're pretty attractive. I was, as I mentioned, I was in Berlin on Friday and Saturday, and there was an event on Saturday during which the German foreign minister said, we really wish you guys were geographically a little closer because we'd love to invite you to join the EU.
What for the UK?
No, he said it. It's public. He said, you guys would make a great European country. He didn't say that. He said, we love the Brits, but we'd really like to have you guys. We also speak French, so... So, you know, I think we need to be careful as Canadians not to think that we're smaller or less influential than we actually are. Having said that, it's true we're not a superpower. And there are ultimately only 36 million of us. And so that's why I think that we need to work so hard. That's two conclusions come from that. One is the rules-based multilateral order is essential for us. A world in which might makes right is a really bad world for Canada. We really, really need a world of rules, and I think Canadians really get that. I think that's one reason that a lot of us feel so strongly about it. The second thing is we know that we can be more effective when we act in concert with our allies. And you know what I suggested to one of Mark's earlier questions is, I think, you know, at the WTO. Since it's been so hard to progress beyond the Doha round, this idea of doing plurilateral deals has developed, that you kind of get groups of like-minded countries to move together in a direction. These deals are open so new countries can come in, and maybe it's because I'm a former trade minister, but I think we have to start thinking and working a little bit in that direction in foreign policy too. And as maybe a big middle power, that's the kind of thing that I think Canada can and should be good at.
Sort of in the middle here.
Dennis Danneman, Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate in economics, said two things prevent countries from going into poverty. One is a free press and the other are democratic elections. How are we going to make sure that the cyber wars and that occurred in the States in the elections don't happen in Canada the next time around?
It's an excellent question. You know, as I said in response to Elizabeth's question, you know, we're aware of it. I think we have to be very aware of the danger of malign foreign interference. I think we need to have, you know, as strong as possible of an impartial and independent democratic media, or not democratic media, also that is across the country. There have been some interesting studies correlating media deserts, places that don't have their own media with a higher incidence of populism. But I think at the end of the day, what it's going to come down to is Canadians, Canadian citizens, Canadian voters making an active political choice. And also, it's about political leadership. Like, I really think, you know, as I think is evident from this conversation, I believe so strongly how precious and valuable our liberal democracy is. And so it's going to be my job and the job of my colleagues to talk to a lot of Canadians and say, guys, this is really important. Let's be sure we don't let it be wrecked.
Back over on the west side. Yep.
Hi, William Cohen. As our NATO allies, such as Hungary, Turkey, Poland, begin to turn away from liberal democracy and towards authoritarianism, how is NATO working to ensure the strength of the alliance, and what's Canada's role in that?
There are too many good questions this evening. I mean, I would put that into two parts. One is what we're doing in NATO, and the other is what do you do, you know, with rising authoritarianism among your friends, as well as among countries that are not military allies. In terms of NATO, and I was just at the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels last week. Canada is very engaged in NATO right now. We lead, as I mentioned, we lead the NATO battle group in Latvia, Operation Enhanced Forward Presence. That is a big and important commitment. We have just taken on the NATO command in the new NATO training mission in Iraq, and the Canadian commander is already there on the ground starting to get to work. We are very engaged in supporting Romania and our allies in the Black Sea. So we really, you know, the rules-based international order started with the Transatlantic Alliance, and we have to first and foremost be sure that that alliance is strong. So we are really engaged. In terms of authoritarianism creeping into countries, you know, I think there are two things happening on the liberal democracy, you know, health watch in the world. One is this assumption we used to have, some people used to have, I probably had it also, because I'm an optimist, that as authoritarian regimes grew richer, they would sort of inevitably move towards being a liberal democracy. And, you know, people often talk about Francis Fukuyama's end of history, but this has been an idea from before that, right? Jean Kirkpatrick talked about it, and it happened in a lot of countries. So that seems not to be working, and we're seeing a lot of authoritarian regimes get richer and decide they want to stay authoritarian, which is worrying and makes this international order harder to maintain. But the second thing we're seeing is countries that had been really quite effectively moving towards being liberal democracies are pulling back. One issue that Canada is concerned about, that we've been public about, partly because Canadian students and professors are involved, is the attacks on Central European University. That was a really great, and here we are in a university, so maybe it's worth mentioning, a really fantastic institution. I think it's really sad for Hungary that it is having to move some of its operations to Vienna. And so we express our views, and we do what we can also. I think this is important as well, to shore up our liberal democratic allies. That's one reason that I think we're working so hard in the Baltics. It's one reason that last week we announced $24 million to support the election in Ukraine this spring, which will be absolutely crucial. And there will be, if invited, there will be a very big Canadian election monitoring mission. We will work to support the OSCE, and part of the work we will do is to try to help try to defend the integrity of that process against outside malign actors.
We're going to have to pause there. Jameson.
Please join me in thanking everyone who was on stage tonight. So my name is James Stevie. I'm the Executive Director of the Martin Prosperity Institute. A couple things in closing. First of all, it's important, I think, sometimes in these moments, we start off with a joke about the minister rolling up on a bike. But this is actually kind of remarkable, that we can have a minister of the Crown freely traveling the streets without armed guards, come to an event where none of you got checked as you walked in the door, where journalists asked questions of a minister in an unprepared format, and then questions came from the floor. So when we worry about the state of this this level of question. We are incredibly literate and bright people. So 4 things in conclusion. Number 1, a story that is only known to about 4 or 5 people. Then Chrystia Freeland had 2 pieces of paper on her desk. One was a contract to become a fellow with the MPI, and the other were her nomination papers. Chrystia Freeland then called me and said, "What do you think?" And I said,